This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
In 1955, Mishima turns 30 years old. His lifelong death drive, like again, I said, there's eventually he seppuku. Eventually he plunges the short sword into his stomach, but it really starts in childhood, right? And this notion that he's going to stab himself, he's obsessed with death. He's entangled, the ecstatic poetry of dying is all entangled with eroticism, with love, with beauty, with aesthetics, with all of it, with meaning itself. When he hits 30, this sort of lifelong death drive, I don't know if you would say it accelerates exactly. It changes shape in some way. At a birthday celebration, at his 30th birthday celebration, he told friends that he was now too old to die beautifully and that a suicide at his age would be unseemly. That's what he tells his guests. And yet, so you've got that. The trip to Greece had seemingly cured him of this sense that he had felt up until the trip to Greece that his environment determined his fate. And so in some ways, he wasn't making, in his own interior reality, he wasn't making choices, that the environment was sort of choosing for him what was going to happen. The trip to Greece gave him a sense that he was actually in control of his life and most importantly, in control to some degree of his physicality. He took up swimming. He learned to be a competent swimmer just from sheer will, apparently. He started boxing. He got his ass kicked basically every single sparring session, but he kind of kept doing it. And then in 1955, he found his thing, weightlifting, bodybuilding. He would do this 3 times a week, every week for the next 15 years, apparently never missing a session.
He just went heavy.
He went hard on it. Yeah. Now, he skipped leg day though. According to John Nathan,
don't skip leg day. Don't skip leg day. Yeah.
Now,
every day is leg day.
Yeah. Now, we're going to talk a little bit now. We're in 1955. This book doesn't come out until 1968, but to really understand what this whole bodybuilding thing is, this is really the text to refer to. This is Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. Sun refers to the sun of being out in the sun, but also it's not lost on anyone. I don't think that the Japanese flag is the rising sun, right? There's the steel is both the steel of the barbell, but also subtly the steel of the sword, right? And he's kind of playing with all of these together. What is this book? Okay. It's a long form essay. It's about 100 pages. It's basically, if I were going to try to sum it up, it's basically about the relationship between Mishima's body and his intellect and what he has learned about both of these through rigorous training. It's about Mishima, in his own words, learning the, quote, language of the flesh. And this comes in two forms: the sun, exposure to the sun, being outside, right? He was never allowed to be outside when he was a little boy. It's about being outside, getting a tan, getting a sunburn. What you did today, Kevin, is about that. It's about just it does make.
I knew I was out there for a reason, and I also learned that October 3rd is National Kevin Day, or it's like international. It's International Kevin Day. I think it's like
what?
National Kevin Day, aka National Hug a Kevin Day.
What?
It's a real thing. October 3rd. You can look it up. So
I mean, I believe you.
I got a little hug from the sun.
Are you Kevin, so oppressed that we need like a?
In Germany, we are. Look it up.
I've heard that before.
Yeah. So October 3rd. This is very good. I went out. I got some sun. It's Hug a Kevin Day. I'm feeling good. I'm vibing.
There's something about getting exposure. It was a nice day here too.
There's something about getting exposure to a Kevin.
Yeah, it just makes you feel alive, you know.
But joking aside, you need to be out getting sun. That's one of the biggest psyops they ever pulled on us. Is this idea is that like too much exposure to the sun and I mean, get out of here. You really can't have enough. I mean, you have to know your own skin. You don't want to be like gooping a bunch of chemicals on yourself. Right. And you don't want to be out there for 12 hours a day if you're like Irish, and you're gonna burn. I mean, clearly, but man, the more you can get, the better.
Absolutely. So it's about that for him, about that, just that fundamental, basic, primal, really human reality of being in the sun, and physical exertion. And his form was primarily weightlifting, but he was also doing other things, but weightlifting was the big thing for him. Now I'm going to read a couple quotes from it. It's an interesting read, and he gets pretty intellectual. But I think for anybody who likes Mishima and hasn't read this yet, I think it's definitely worth reading. It's a pretty quick read. I mean, you can read it in 2 or 3 sittings maybe. Let me just read a couple parts and give you a sense of what he's doing here. Quote, "How dearly indeed I loved my pit, my dusky room, the area of my desk with its piles of books. How I enjoyed with introspection shrouded myself in cogitation. With what rapture did I listen for the rustling of frail insects in the thickets of my nerves." Right. So he's just talking about what it's like to be in your basement, working on your book, reading your books. Right. There's now. Let me get to another part where he's sort of getting into the physicality aspect of it. Quote, "My only interest lay in following consciousness through to its extreme limits so as to discover at what point it was converted into unconscious power. That being so, what surer witness to the persistence of consciousness to its outer limits could I have found than physical suffering?" Right. So in some ways he's saying physical suffering, like the whole I think therefore I am. It's sort of like I suffer therefore I am. Right. There is an undeniable interdependence between consciousness and physical suffering, and consciousness conversely affords the surest possible proof of the persistence of bodily distress. Pain, I came to feel, might well prove to be the sole proof of the persistence of consciousness within the flesh, the sole physical expression of consciousness. As my body acquired muscle and in turn strength, there was gradually born within me a tendency toward the positive acceptance of pain, and my interest in physical suffering deepened. Even so, I would not have it believed that this development was a result of the workings of my imagination. My discovery was made directly with my body, thanks to the sun and the steel. Read a little bit more here. Quote, "Facile cynicism invariably is related to feeble muscles or obesity, while the cult of the hero and a mighty nihilism are always related to a mighty body and well-tempered muscles. For the cult of the hero is ultimately the basic principle of the body, and in the long run is intimately involved with the contrast between the robustness of the body and the destruction that is death. The body carries quite sufficient persuasion to destroy the to destroy the comic aura that surrounds an excessive self-awareness. For though a fine body may be tragic, there is in it no trace of the comic. The thing that ultimately saves the flesh from being ridiculous is the element of death that resides in the healthy, vigorous body. It is this, I realize, that sustains the dignity of the flesh. How comic would one find the gaiety and elegance of the bullfighter were his trade entirely divorced from associations of death? So even though he's getting stronger and stronger and physically fit and healthy and kind of getting rid of the self-loathing, the sword is still coming for him, right? He's still narrowing and converging towards something to death. Here's another thing. Here's another bit. Excuse me. Quote, I now realize that the kind of task in which to burnish the imagination for death and danger comes to have the same significance as burnishing the sword had long been calling to me from a distance. Only weakness and cowardice had made me avoid it. To keep death in mind from day to day, to focus each moment upon inevitable death, to make sure one's worst forebodings coincided with one's dreams of glory, if that was all, then it was sufficient to transfer to the world of the flesh what I had long been doing in the world of the spirit. Okay, now, I think
he came into his body in a very intentional way.
Yeah, on purpose, for sure. Right.
Yeah, and if you're young, or even if you're not young and you're struggling and you've never lifted heavy, allow me to recommend it. I'm not a bodybuilder.
Yeah,
I'm not going to post physique or whatever, but it's probably the best thing you can do for yourself.
Oh, it never lies to you. It never lies to you.
Yeah.
All right. There's other interesting stuff he's going on too in here that I think is almost as interesting or more interesting. There's stuff about what he, I think, refers to as the secret language of action. Let me read a little bit about that. The groups of muscles that have become virtually unnecessary in modern life, though still a vital element of a man's body, are obviously pointless from a practical point of view, and bulging muscles are as unnecessary as a classical education is to the majority of practical men. Muscles have gradually become something akin to classical Greek. To revive the dead language, the discipline of steel was required. To change the silence of death into the eloquence of life, the aid of steel was essential. So he's trying to literally, there's another thing going on here too, where he's trying to reincarnate into his own body and live a heroic story, sort of. There's an element of which is the old Mishima is gone, and I am going to inhabit what was good, what was strong about that Mishima is going to live in this now strong body and carry out something meaningful and worthwhile. Now, there's also a lot in here about the opposition. And again, this is in 1968. We're going to go back to him in his early 30s, but he starts lifting heavy in 1955, and 13 years later, he writes this book, and sort of about what he learns through that process about himself and about reality, I guess, as a human being. So there's a lot about the opposition. He's almost resentment, but at least the opposition he has to words by 1968 and to art by 1968. Quote, let's see. Is that what I want to read? Yeah. Quote, that which lurked beyond the flash of the fist and the stroke of the fencing sword was at the opposite pole from verbal expression. That much, at least, was apparent from the feeling it conveyed of being the essence of something extremely concrete, the essence even of reality. In no sense at all could it be called a shadow. Beyond the fist, beyond the tip of the bamboo sword, a new reality had reared its head, a reality that rejected all attempts to make it abstract. Indeed, that flatly rejected all expression of phenomena by resort to abstractions. The opponent and I There, above all, lay the essence of action and of power. That reality, in popular parlance, was referred to quite simply as the opponent. The opponent and I dwelt in the same world. When I looked, the opponent was seen. When the opponent looked, I was seen. We faced each other, moreover, without any intermediary imagination, both belonging to the same world of action and strength, the world, that is, of being seen. The opponent was in no sense an idea, for although by climbing step by step up the ladder of verbal expression in pursuit of an idea, and by gazing intently at that idea, we may well succeed in blinding ourselves to the light, that idea will never gaze back at us. In a realm where at every moment one's gaze is returned, one is never given time to express things in words. In order to express oneself, one needs to stand outside the world in question. Since that world as a whole never returns one's scrutiny, one is given time to look and to express at leisure what one has found. But one will never succeed in getting at the essence of a reality that returns one's gaze. So there's something in here about the failure in some ways of, not the failure, but the shortcomings, at least, about abstraction, about writing, about the life of the mind. I don't know that he ever will completely throw the life of the mind overboard, but it's obvious that not only did he come to understand that he was missing something by solely focusing on writing books, but that something was the missing
And this
piece.
is a pure example of, I think, what Gurdjieff would talk about. And he probably overcompensated in this other direction. This was a guy who had no chill. But
exactly.
There really is something to be said for, and if you haven't listened to the Gurdjieff episode, finish listening to this one, then go way back in the catalog at darkpod.com or wherever you get your podcasts and go check out the Gurdjieff episode. But the thing that Gurdjieff was all about was like, look, you've got to balance these different centers. And if all you do is box and lift weights and you never pick up a book, you're not whole,
right?
You're not living a whole life. And maybe it's not a book, maybe it's something, I don't know, crossword puzzles, something. You have to activate different centers in order to evolve, copacetically as a person.
The human body and mind, it's very complicated. It has I was even thinking about that today. I mean, this seems silly, but I had this sort of profound moment that, like, feeding my dog just eats the same kibble every single day, and it's fine. The dog's fine with that. Wants other stuff, but it's fine. I need to have like a different kind of food, like 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day, right?
Sure.
And partly that's like the varied nutritional demands that a human being has, right? Like we're strange biological organisms. And it's like that for everything else too. It's like, you need a physical aspect of your life. You need a mental aspect of your life. You need an emotional aspect. You need all of these things, kind of, right?
Yeah. But you only need one podcast, and that's the Art of Darkness podcast. and if this doesn't work out, we are going to do an AI startup for human kibble. See,
they already have it, Soylent or Huel or whatever, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you only need, all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, suppose, you only need it, but imagine living on that for a year.
Wither. Yeah. You just want to be terrible. Yeah. Then you'd really want to stab yourself.
Right.
I'm so sick of this fucking kibble.
Done. Yeah. Back to the 50s. 1956. Mishima publishes a book called The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Quite good. It's parts of it are shown in the Paul Schrader Mishima film. In a very stylized and abstract. And one of my favorite parts of the film is the Temple of the Golden Pavilion portion. This book sold even more than The Sound of the Waves. So Sound of Waves broke the record. He breaks it again with the next book, Temple of the Golden Pavilion. I'm going to read you a couple quick things from here. This is actually from the intro to the English edition, written by a woman named Nancy Wilson Ross. And this will tell you the backdrop and how Mishima how he's situating himself and his work in Japanese culture and history. Quote, in 1950, Mishima's book comes out in 1956. Quote, in 1950, to the distress and horror of all art-loving and patriotic Japanese, the ancient Zen temple of Kinkakuji in Kyoto was deliberately burned to the ground. This golden pavilion, a rare masterpiece of Buddhist garden architecture, dated back over 500 years to the days of the great shogun Yoshimitsu, military leader, aesthete, and powerful patron of the Zen cult, who near the end of his amazing career abdicated to take the tonsure. The Kinkakuji tradition said had served as a retreat for this hard-driven shogun of the 14th century. Now, so there's this pavilion, right? Historical, beautiful. Let's see. So revered was this historic and religious shrine that enjoyed in Japan the status of a national treasure. It was willfully set fire to and destroyed by an unhappy and unbalanced student of Zen Buddhism. Now, this is where Mishima takes his story, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. He takes great poetic liberties with it, but it's inspired by this event, right? And so you can imagine there's something about in the premise of the book is basically that the temple is so beautiful that the student, this is underselling it, but to boil it down, the student can't live up to the beauty of it, and so he has to destroy it. It affects him so it affects him so deeply, and serves as such a judge of his inadequacies that he has to destroy it. And there's something about Mishima bringing together the long historical culture of Japan, right? This old temple, the crises of modernity after the war, the internal and again how that manifests internally in the psyche of an individual person, right? It's a great book. I really, really do recommend A Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Let me just read a quick passage, just so you can get a sense of what it feels like. Let's see. This is a pretty short one. Quote: like a moon that hangs in the night sky, the Golden Temple had been built as a symbol of the Dark Ages. Therefore, it was necessary for the Golden Temple of my dreams to have darkness bearing down on it from all sides. In this darkness, the beautiful, slender pillars of the building rested quietly and steadily, emitting a faint light from inside. Whatever words people might speak to the Golden Temple, it must continue to stand there silently, displaying its delicate structure to the eyes of the world and enduring the darkness that surrounded it. I also used to think of the copper gold phoenix, which crowned the roof of the Golden Temple and which had remained there year after year exposed to the elements. This mysterious golden bird never crowed at the break of dawn, never flapped its wings. Indeed, it had itself no doubt completely forgotten that it was a bird. Yet it would be untrue to say that this bird did not look as if it were flying. Other birds fly through the air, but this golden phoenix was flying eternally through time on its shining wings. Time struck those wings and floated backwards. In order to fly, the phoenix remained motionless with a look of anger in its eyes, holding its wings aloft, fluttering the feathers of its tail, bravely stretching its majestic golden legs. It is no exaggeration to say that the first real problem I faced in my life was that of beauty. My father was only a simple country priest, deficient in vocabulary, and he taught me that there is nothing on this earth so beautiful as the Golden Temple. At the thought that beauty should already have come into this world unknown to me, I could not help feeling a certain uneasiness and irritation. If beauty really did exist there, it meant that my own existence was a thing estranged from beauty. But for me, the Golden Temple was never simply an idea. The mountains blocked it from my sight, yet if I should want to see it, the temple was always there for me to go and see. Beauty was thus an object that one could touch with one's fingers, that could be clearly reflected in one's eyes. I knew and I believed that, amid all the changes of the world, the Golden Temple remained there safe and immutable. Okay, so
the temple, we're not just talking about the temple. We're talking about a lot of something that you all can almost sort of reach out and touch, but is almost indefinable.
Yeah, and I think there's something, and part of the reason I kind of wanted to touch on this passage is we talked early on about Mishima's his life and his work revolving around these sort of ideas of beauty, of ecstasy, of death, and what does beauty, what does beauty mean? I got thinking about because he would sometimes say he was seeking an aesthetic death, or people would say about him he was seeking an aesthetic death. And the word aesthetic is undergoing this interesting and unfortunate degradation, I would say, at the moment. It's come to mean just something to look good, right? Somebody's like, oh, that's a really aesthetic. You like, bookstagrammers or influencers are sort of, oh, it's a very aesthetic image. And yet all they're really saying is, I like it. It looks good. Right. And I'm not going to go into an hour of theory on aesthetics now, but I guess what I want to kind of point to is there's, and I think Mishima would be distressed to some degree by this. I think the internet, and allow me to just get in my soapbox for a minute, the internet has allowed for like the proliferation of like almost like a kind of pornography that's not necessarily like porno, but like pornography is, I've come to think of like the one of the aspects of something pornographic that's sort of a problem is that it doesn't require anything of you, right? You just you're able to just have it.
It's a Nickelodeon in your hand,
right?
And of course you end up giving it your soul,
right? You are making a trade-off. You're going to make a trade-off somewhere, right? Yeah.
It gets into the McLuhan business a little bit, and we're going to cover McLuhan in season 4, 2024, Art of Darkness. Have we announced that one yet? Well, we just did now. So are you doing McLuhan or am I? I think
you're doing it.
I might be. Well, in any case, the medium is the message. But really, truly, like the way you consume a thing, that is part of the aesthetic experience. And you're totally right to point this out. Aesthetic doesn't just mean pretty.
Right.
It means framing, context, time, place, execution, how it's consumed. What does it ultimately mean?
Right.
What could it mean to mean? Right. Yeah, there's a lot.
I think for Mishima, for him, aesthetics was about what could be, how a thing was arranged or observed or found in a way that reflected and sort of reified the brutal elegance of life, both brutal and elegant at the same time. And I think that's sort of what he was pursuing, was if you saw deeply enough, if you felt deeply enough, you could die in a manner that was aesthetically beautiful, right? Oof. In some ways, that would be like a poem.
It's funny because it reminds me of Doug Stanhope on his show, where he is the death. What do they call it? His death pool.
Yeah.
The death pool.
Yeah.
But he had like a challenge where come up with the most creative suicide. And some of them were hilarious. It involved roller coasters and super gluing your own head and
super gluing your hands to the head and hanging yourself on a piano wire so it looked like you pulled your own head off.
You have to have a certain kind of humor, but what's funny is they're talking about the exact same thing that Mishima is, but in a comic way, in a reverent way. But you're fundamentally talking about the same impulse.
Yeah. Well, it's this huge moment in life, right? It makes me think
it's the last thing you're ever going to do.
Yeah.
And this gets into sort of, and he's writing roughly maybe a little later than the existentialists, like roughly they were all contemplating a very similar thing. If this is the last thing that we have control over, it feels like it ought to mean something,
right? And there's a certain, and it makes me think too of like the notion that, so Mishima's trying to, he's doing it, he's sort of practicing it or playing it out in different versions in his writing, and he's sort of trying to get the balance of terror and awe and alienation and elation and getting it all arranged in a particular way to get that last sort of ecstatic moment. And again, not having an opinion one way or another, what he did at the end of his life was right, but trying to articulate why he's constantly pointing in this direction. It makes me think about the fact that this is interesting. So you know that feeling you get goosebumps, palation, where you get like hairs on the back of your neck stand up.
Sure.
We get those in a couple of different aspects of our life. We get them when we have a moment of like awe. Like if you see something just breathtakingly beautiful or experience something breathtaking, like music can make you feel like that sometimes. You just get the certain kind of oof, like just really gets you. I've experienced it in certain landscapes. Like I remember in Alaska stepping out to this vista and just getting like, oh my God, like I forgot how big the world is, sort of. And then you also, but it comes from biologically, it comes from terror. It's literally the little nodules that hold your hair stiffening up like a cat puffing up to make itself look bigger. It's the same circuit. So this awe and terror of death are deeply connected somewhere.
What we mean when we talk about fear of God. You have to have fear of God.
Yeah. God, an experience of God where you're like confronted with the reality of it in some way is awful.
Awesome. Awesome and awful.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting. Anyway. Yeah. I need to get that out of my
I feel that
system.
way when I walk into a Costco.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now Mishima, 1957, his stars continuing to rise. He writes a book called Misstepping of Virtue. This is one of his minor works. It is about highbrow scandalousness, which, according to John Nathan, is something that the Japanese public always seems to love in its films and in its books. I don't know. This book, interestingly, I really only talk about it because this book led to adulteresses in Japan apparently being called lady missteppers. So he writes a book called A Misstepping of Virtue, and a year or two later, if some woman's stepping out on her husband, you call her a lady misstepper. Kind of interesting. So he's memeing, he has a volume of his plays, 5 modern no plays, published by Knopf. Do you say it Knopf or Knopf, the publisher?
I would say Knopf.
Knopf? Yeah,
Knopf.
Okay. That sounds right.
Yeah.
So this is published in America, in New York, in English, and does fairly well for the extent that something like that's going to do, right? So it's going to be a little bit of a curiosity. It's not going to necessarily be a big seller, but he's desperately wants to be known in America. Mishima does. Now he goes to the United States around the time that this comes out. He does a bunch of interviews, and he has a bunch of speeches that he gives at various colleges and things. And it's funny, he's in New York and he asks his translator, Donald Keene. Nobody seems to notice him or pay any attention to him. And he says to Donald Keene, "What do you have to do to get famous in this city?" And Donald Keene responds to him. He says, "Listen, Faulkner and Hemingway could walk arm in arm down this street and no one would pay any attention."
Yeah. So true.
Yeah. Now, quick thing about no plays. Just so people know what he was doing. A no, N-A-N-O-H or N-O with the horizontal bar over the O, is a major form of classical Japanese dance drama that has been performed since the 14th century, developed by Kanami and his son Ziyami. It is the oldest major theater art that is still regularly performed today. Although the terms no and nogaku are sometimes used interchangeably, nogaku encompasses both no and kyojin. Traditionally, a full nogaki program included several no plays with comedic kyojin plays in between. An abbreviated program of 2 no plays with 1 kyojin piece has become common today. No is often based on tales from traditional literature with a supernatural being transformed into a human form as a hero narrating a story. There's masks, costumes, props, like I said, dance. I would like to see one of these, to be honest with you. It sounds very, very interesting.
You can find them on YouTube.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Watch them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's highly formal.
Yeah.
It's very structured.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Almost
precise.
ritualistic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mishima did secure a Broadway production from this translation, which began in a typically American, which played out in a very typically American way. Very frustrating for Mishima. Broken promises, blown budgets, circumambulatory excuses for why things weren't happening, and Mishima was going to try and stay for the production, and eventually, after about 4 months, he got so frustrated and pissed off at everything that he just left and didn't tell anybody. He just went back to Japan. Eventually, it did go on Broadway, and I don't know how successful it was necessarily, but in some ways, it's not that he gave up on American fame. He sort of, I think he reached a point where it's like it's going to either happen on its own or it's not. Like, I don't understand that world over there, how they do things. Hopefully it does, but it's not going to have. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. I'm just going to have to keep writing my book.
The great white way,
right,
of Broadway, where great art happens.
Right. Oh yeah.
Notably, that will be $500 for a ticket, please.
Right.
Oh,
right.
Wow.
$500 to see this play about the class struggle in America.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, 1958, Mishima comes back from America. He decides that it's about time that he get married. The rumors of his homosexuality had bubbled up to his father time and time again, and his younger brother was already married. So, in what might be another bid to seem normal, or maybe appease his parents, his mother had fallen ill and wasn't long for this world. So it may have been to give her that before she died in some ways. Obviously, it's a confluence of factors. Mishima, in order to get married, puts out the word out that he is searching for a wife, mostly through his alumni network at the Peers School. I am part of a couple not part of a couple alumni networks. I am on an email list for a couple of alumni networks, and I never get any marriage proposals through there. I just get people asking me for money.
Yeah, you gotta read between the lines, though, Brad. I mean, this is really something about how the other half lives when you begin to understand how the upper middle class and the professional managerial class and the true upper class lives. They're doing the exact same thing. They just have different ways of going about it.
That's true.
They would never come out and say so and so is looking for a wife, but they'll place articles here and there.
Sure.
They'll it's very interesting, but we're never going to speak their language. So
that's true.
That's okay though.
Yeah. Now we have to understand he is a very eligible bachelor. He's very successful. He's pretty wealthy. You're muted there.
Yeah, I was going to ask at some point, did he get a beard? I mean, is he really looking for a wife to have children with? Or
well, this is the part of the story we're in, right? So but he's wealthy, he's very successful, he's reasonably good looking, I think. I don't know. He's counteracted. He's starting to fill out. He's fit. He's not the thin, sickly, pale guy he used to be anyway.
Ladies, t.me/Art of Dark Pod. Is Mishima good looking?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Let us know. And gentlemen.
Yeah, whatever your take on. I'm curious.
Whatever you are. Creatures.
Yeah.
Get in t.me/Art of Dark Pod and let us know, and tag Brad in there because Brad's not sure.
I don't know for sure. Yeah.
I don't know either.
I don't think he's ugly, but I can't rate him. Now he gets the first woman that comes out of this applicant pool, he tries to woo her. That in the applicant pool that he's interested in, he tries to woo her, and she tells him that she would rather kill herself than marry him. So it doesn't go well off the bat. She basically says her parents or somebody had put her in the applicant pool without her knowledge, and she was like, "I'm not marrying that dude. What are you talking about? I would rather die." Yeah.
Oh.
Now, 1958, there's also, funnily, there's a Mishima and the Crown Prince would get married in the same month to different people. And there was a weekly magazine poll. There's this magazine that polled single women in the country and said, if Mishima and the Crown Prince were the last two men on Earth, which one would you marry? About half of the women polled said they would rather commit suicide than marry either of them. So while Mishima was on paper kind of eligible, he wasn't a sex symbol exactly. He did have there were a handful of women who were sort of obsessed with him, like, you know, as you might expect.
Listen,
but
that's all you need.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
Now he did eventually get introduced through this process to a woman named Yoko, different Yoko. Quote, sometime in March, an old friend of the family brought to his attention a 19-year-old college sophomore named Yoko Sugiyama. Yoko's father was Nii Sugiyama, one of Japan's most famous traditional painters, a fact which may have recommended Yoko to Mishima in itself, since he had felt stupid about art all his life, as if it were his cultural Achilles heel. Naturally, he also must have found Yoko attractive as a woman, or at least not unattractive. Although it might be expected that he would have preferred boyish women, Yoko Sugiyama was not boyish at all. She was a small woman, but she had an ample body and a full, pretty face, which conveys, in photographs taken that year, a kind of innocence and vulnerability. Certainly, Yoko was a pretty young woman by any standards, a young woman who would look well in public and particularly well in company with Mishima. She was, for example, even shorter than he. Mishima was not a tall man. Unquestionably, this was an important consideration. In an essay called, an essay Mishima wrote called "The Writer and Marriage," which he published in July of 1958 to, quote, clear up a few simple questions in his readers' minds, Mishima wrote that it made no difference to him how badly his wife managed the household, so long as she comported herself in public in a manner appropriate to the wife of a writer. Quote, with regard to her behavior in the outside world, I will not be generous with her. The world will be watching. In the same essay, Mishima informed his readers that he had set out to find, quote, a young lady firmly planted who suited my tastes and who would agree to various difficult stipulations attached to marriage with me. So now Yoko, she married, they become married. He's an unusual guy, obviously. He had perhaps little to no sexual interest in her, and maybe not even any romantic interest. She was, however, faithful with him to the end, beyond the end even. She would refuse to ever speculate or elaborate on his sexuality. She said very, very little about what it was like to live with him. She refused to allow Paul Schrader to use parts of the novel Forbidden Colors in his biopic, because that was the one with the most prominent homosexual love story aspect. She did not want that to be used. They would have 2 children together. And for his part, Mishima was, at least from the outside, seemed to be honestly pretty good to her. Even, I mean, he would travel with her. He would appear in public with her in a way that was very uncommon for highly successful Japanese time at the Men, according to John Nathan. He invited her into conversations with other writers, which was sort of unheard of. You know, then they had children, a daughter in 1959 and a son in 1962. Mishima seems to have been actually at least adequately fatherly towards them, as long as it didn't interrupt his writing. He seemed to be a reasonably good dad. We don't have a lot of inside information on that, but everything we know, he was just like a normal dad to them. So pretty cool. Now, some issues did arise in the marriage. One was that Mishima was constantly, for a while anyway, having bodybuilding parties at home. Now, personal for a second, I've been lifting weights for a long time. I've never had a bodybuilding party. I don't even know what that would be exactly. Maybe I just don't get invited. He would bring weightlifters.
That's the same group chat as the one from before.
Okay.
Yeah.
He would bring home weightlifter friends from the gym. They would get drunk. They would talk about bodybuilding, and they would strip down to trunks, their shorts, and oil up their bodies and pose for a photographer that Mishima had hired to come over and take pictures. Yeah. Oof. At some point, Yoko was like, his wife was just like, come on, man.
I just have to say this. Imagine the smell.
Right.
I mean, it's
Right. It smells a little
yo,
crazy in there.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mishima and Yoko, bring the kibbles
Right.
for my friends.
Right.
Bring the human kibble, not
Yeah.
the dog, the human
The
kibble.
human kibble.
For
Yeah.
we're having a bodybuilding
My
party.
bodybuilding. We're having a bodybuilding party. Have you never
Bring
been to
the
a bodybuilding party?
oils
Yeah.
and the human kibble.
Right. Right.
Honey.
The photographer's waiting. Yeah.
That is a scene.
It is, right? Okay, 1959. Mishima publishes a novel that he'd worked on longer and harder than any of his books up until then. This is Kyoko's House. To my understanding, there is not an English translation of this in print. However, apparently Paul Schrader commissioned a English translation of this book to use in adapting and making the Mishima film. But you can't, as far as I know, in English, you cannot read this book. I could be wrong. Please, out there, audience, if you're aware of one, let me know, but I don't think you can. This book tells the interconnected stories of four young men who represent different facets of Mishima's personality. His athletic side appears as a boxer, his artistic side as a painter, his narcissistic performing side as an actor, and his secretive nihilistic side as a businessman who goes through the motions of living a normal life while practicing, quote, absolute contempt for reality. Yeah, what's maybe most interesting about this book, and there are some excerpts of it in the John Nathan biography, I think it's this in combination with a story that he writes a few years later called Patriotism. I think this is where you start to see really the explanation for the coup that's coming, right? And the coup and the suicide that comes about a decade later. Let me quickly read a little bit on this. So it seems like a fairly interesting book. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So and there's a couple quote excerpts from the book just to give you a sense of it.
You got it.
Admit it. You love destruction. Wait, who is speaking? The businessman solution. Yeah. The businessman says, who goes through the motions of living, says, admit it. You love destruction. You'll always remember the vast, refreshing radiance of that endless, burnt-out ruin. When you gaze at the city today, you see only a memory of the past. When you walk the restored, chilly concrete of a sidewalk, if you can't feel the warmth of embers and the scorched earth beneath your feet, something is missing for you. If you can't see through the glass of a modern building to the dandelions that grew from the chinks in the ruined wall, you're desolate. Here's another bit later from the nihilist's point of view. Quote, a gulf separates the death we felt so close to during the war and today's uneventful, peaceful world. Suddenly we were driven from a life in which death was a reality into a world where death is no more than an idea. The sense of reality we enjoyed in a life that was close to death has now been transformed into an idea. Conversely, what was unmistakably fantasy during the war has become the reality of everyday life. Here's another little bit. Is this continue? Yeah. Okay. This is the boxer and his friend. Yeah. I think this is the friend. Yeah, this is the boxer's friend who's become something of an ideologue. Quote, we Japanese must reveal the true form of our imperial land in which the sovereign and the people are gloriously united. We must become an example of the freedom, the peace, the happiness, and the spiritual enlightenment desired by every nation in the world and every race. It is our heaven-sent mission to stake our lives on our faith in the emperor and to guard the prosperity of our imperial throne. Therein resides our greatness, our sublimity. What the hell is that? The boxer said. That's ideology. Do you believe it? I don't even understand it. Then listen to some more. We will clarify the ideals of empire, uplift the Japanese spirit, sweep communism away, rectify capitalism, and revise the constitution imposed on us as a defeated nation to our lasting humiliation. We will have the traitorous Communist Party outlawed and promote rearmament in the name of peace, independence, and self-defense. We will overthrow the ruling class, acting in concert with the communist traitors and providing their spawning ground, and we will establish a new order, a mutual prosperity in which the people shall thrive. What's that all about? That's ideology too. And do you believe that? Right? So he's laying out, he's sort of hiding it in characters that you're not entirely supposed to be sympathetic to, but he's sort of laying out some of the things that he is later going to espouse on the balcony at the base of the Japanese Self-Defense Force. Okay. 1960s. Kyoko's House, that book we were just kind of reading bits and bobs of, sold pretty well, but it was received very coldly by critics. Probably because it was talking so much trash about the communists and the left. Some called it Mishima's first big failure. This engendered
telling me the critics lean to the left, Brett?
Well, I
guess it depends, doesn't it?
Yeah. It depends. It does depend. This sort of quote unquote failure engendered a very bitter response from Mishima. We have to understand everything he has done has knocked out of the park critical and commercial success.
Right. At some point, he's going to have to run into some barbed wire. Right. He's going to have to trip over his own feet at some point.
It's impossible not to, right? It'd be impossible not to. But he did not respond well to it. A month after it came out, he decides that he's going to star he decides he's going to star as a gangster in the film Tough Guy. So he gets he bumps up against one little bit of like, people don't like it, and he's like, "Oh yeah, well I'll show you." And he decides he's going to be a gangster in this.
I'm going to be an actor,
right? Because it's a very kind of frankly narcissistic kind of move. There's one little bit about this that I want to read. Wait, do I want to read that? Yes, hold on, I got to get the right page. So it's kind of funny because he has very little acting experience. I mean, he's done a little bit on the stage, but very little. Mishima, quote, Mishima seized every opportunity to place himself in the most ludicrous light. He dressed like a movie star in striped shirts and flashy ties, a pinstripe suit, and of course, dark glasses. He showed his interviewers fan letters, which read, "Mishima, have you got the face of a movie star? Take a look in the mirror." Asked if he had confidence he could play the part, he replied, "Absolutely," because he had checked and satisfied himself that all the actresses were shorter than he. And more than once, he delivered a coup de theater by unbuttoning his shirt and proudly displaying his chest hair. The media loved it. Week after week, the headlines hooted. Pistol in hand, he flaunts the hair on his chest. Mishima shows us his chest hair. Impressively, Mishima plays a hairy gunman.
Okay, there seems to be a hirsute fixation here.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess. I mean, we're not that different now. Hair comes up in the discourse all the time.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Not for you, Brad.
No. Filming began on February 1960 and took 6 weeks. The director, Masumura, is said to have driven Mishima mercilessly. The scenes which brought him the most abuse were those with his beautiful co-star, Ayako Wakao. Masumura was determined that the hero should be both tender and gruff, but the tenderness simply wasn't there. So he reshot interminably, working the crew far into the night and making it clear that Mishima was to blame. Finally, he threw up his hands and screamed, "You like to slap her so much, go ahead, slap away." In the final version, so apparently Mishima enjoyed slapping this woman in one of the scenes. I don't know. In the final version, there is scarcely an encounter between Mishima and his lady when he is not slapping her, sometimes tenderly on the back, but mostly, quote, gruffly in the face. So the film
he's doing really improvisational slapping as a gangster,
I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, showing everybody his chest hair.
Showing his chest hair, and he's got a pistol, and he's a tough, and he's a gangster.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean,
that's a character.
Yeah. Now, yeah. Okay. So let's see. There's There's one other thing I want to read real quick. This time in the 60s, it's hard to figure out what to talk about because it's literally, there's so much going on. He's publishing so much. He's got so much success. In the early 60s, he builds a house Before he had bought some houses, but this time he's going to build the house that he wants. Okay. And he's in the newspapers. This is right after the Tough Guy movie, all this. Quote, like everything he created, Mishima's house was consummately logical in its own terms. Had he wanted a Japanese house, he explained, he could have copied the famous Katsura detached palace in Kyoto, for surely there could be no finer monument to Japanese architecture. But the simplicity which was Japan's crowning architectural achievement did not allow comfortable living. Since only in the West was comfort the primary consideration in house design, he must have a quintessentially Western house, a house as unlike a Zen temple as any house could possibly be. For Mishima, the essence of the West was late Baroque, clashing colors, garishness. Even the walls of the Parthenon were splashed with color. As he explained to his horrified architect, I want to sit on Rococo furniture wearing Levi's and an Aloha shirt. That's my ideal of a lifestyle.
Yeah, he's got this weird modernity and then appreciation for the ancient and the traditional.
Yeah,
it's all
you just don't, for a guy whose like reputation is this like arch right ultra nationalist, you don't expect him to like Levi's so much. You know, you expect him to have some resistance to all of that, but he doesn't. He fully embraces it.
Yeah, and he feels international. All this business with having his wife in conversations and being with her in public. So there's this, I don't think everything is very tidy.
Yeah.
You can't really pigeonhole him.
He would have Christmas parties, which like nobody in Tokyo had Christmas parties. Even, I mean, there's Christians in Japan, but like very few people had actual Christmas parties. He had a part of his house that you kept your shoes on in, which was a big deal. Like that's totally weird. There's a bunch of little things like this where he was constantly like, and I think he partially did it to provoke people. It was like, look how hip and cool I am, right?
Sure.
Look how how different I am from you guys.
Eccentric,
totally eccentric. And there's a thing. I know we know how he what happened at his died when he died. Excuse me, but in the early 1960s, he was almost apolitical. He hadn't written anything that was overtly political. Really. He hadn't made any public statements politically, really. He wasn't really thought of as a political guy necessarily. It would be like, you know, you saying like, what are Jonathan Franzen's politics? You're like, well, he's, he probably votes for Democrats. But like beyond that, I don't know what it's,
I wouldn't want to disrespect Franzen by assuming I know.
Right.
Especially now because so much has changed over the past few years too. You don't know.
That's true. But like my point is like he's not public, whatever it is, he's not public about it. I don't really know, or any other like fairly well-known writer. I don't really know.
Personally, I'm just pulling the lever for John McCain.
Eternally.
I'm writing him in. That's my politics.
Yeah. Now
that man's a goddamn hero.
Amen.
This is where Brad. This is where you say, Kevin, I have some news for you.
No, man.
Just keep writing them in.
Yeah. Why not?
No, but that's interesting. So he's having bodybuilding parties. He's having
Christmas parties.
He's got a
weird house
with
wearing an Aloha shirt and slapping women around on the set of movies. Strange dude.
Yeah, there's more of a Hunter S. Thompson thing going on than I think people would maybe want to realize. It's like a Japanese Hunter S. Thompson for the right wing.
Well, something like that. Yeah,
maybe
it's kind of hard
to
a
little bit.
Yeah, that's what's interesting about doing this research. As I'm going, like every couple of years, I'm like, wait, what is he doing? Like, I had a hard time keeping up with him, sort of, So 1960, basically apolitical. 1968, he's publicly declaring that he's ready to die with a sword in hand in battle with the left, right? And in 1970, he does this attempts this coup, and then he commits suicide, right? So it's like we got to account for the 1960s somehow here, right? How do you go from this fashionable, intelligent, artist to the guy who's, in a military uniform he designed, stabbing himself in the stomach with this short sword? Okay, I'm gonna read a little bit from an article called Mishima Yukio and his suicide. This is, again, an article from Modern Asian Studies. Just to give us a little bit of a sense. Quote, I have mentioned the obsession with death and apocalyptic aspiration to the end of the world as pervasive elements in Mishima's novels. However, if we adopt the view that Mishima's work constitutes an autonomous world, these elements in themselves do not account for Mishima's own tragic death. What of Mishima's trilogy that deals with the coup d'etat of 1936? So we'll get to that trilogy and we'll talk about it a little bit. His story Patriotism of 1959, Kiku on the 10th, which is a play that came out in 1961, and The Voices of the Heroic Dead in 1966. Even in these works, Mishima's aim is not to treat the historical incidents as such, but to create out of them situations in which the consciousness of individual characters is revealed. In Patriotism, for instance, the February 26th incident itself is in the background, and in the foreground are the lieutenant and his wife, whose integrity through death is curiously identified with their passionate lovemaking. But we should notice a change in the relation between Mishima's life and art. In his earlier works, the apocalyptic wish for the end of the world is conceived by negative characters who are handicapped in various ways and cannot master life. In The Army Mutineer, on the contrary, this is in the story Patriotism, Mishima represents a character who is no longer handicapped, but fulfills his personal integrity by his physical strength. Curiously enough, this is exactly what Mishima practiced in his own life. And then that character in Patriotism commits seppuku. So he's still the sword, no matter what he does, this sword is still constantly coming after him. No matter how famous he gets, no matter how rich he gets, no matter how healthy he gets, no matter how much bodybuilding he does, it always finds a way to keep progressing towards his stomach. Let's talk a little bit about so here's something where it starts to get a little bit political. Okay, I was going to talk about that story Patriotism, but I think I'll kind of gloss over it and focus on something a little differently. Because another thing to think about, okay, so there's other writers, and we haven't mentioned very many of them since he was a young man. He has this story Patriotism that comes out that's a sort of his first real sort of hard right nationalist piece. In the same month, future Nobel winner Kenzaburo Oe, sort of the leftist yang to Mishima's more conservative yin. I don't know if I'm getting the yings and the yangs right. He publishes a story that almost at the same month, it almost seems like a parody of Mishima's work, right? So there's Mishima has found himself on one side of a conversation, whether he did this intentionally or not. Now, around this time,
one thing about leftism is you gotta be on board. If you're not on board, they're gonna pick you out.
Yeah.
Especially as things start to get a little more heightened, a little more intense.
And that's happening here into the 60s for him.
Sure.
Right? Around this time that this story Patriotism comes out, which is basically it's a retelling of a 1936 coup attempt. I think it was a coup attempt. Anyway, around this time that this Patriotism story comes out, the chairman of the Socialist Party was assassinated by a young rightist named Yamaguchi, who
runs
through him with a sword. Yeah.
That picture is intense.
It's intense. Yeah.
That if you've never seen that, I think that, well, in any case, that is a heavy, he got assassinated by a sword.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah. Now, how did Mishima feel about this? In 1968, when asked at a teach-in for his opinion of Yamaguchi, Mishima replied this: Yamaguchi was splendid. As you know, he took his own life afterward. In dying that way, he was being faithful to the letter of Japanese tradition. Notice he didn't say anything about the politics there. It's about the act. How did he carry out the act? Right.
He didn't just assassinate his political enemy. He killed himself after,
which was apparently, according to Mishima, would be the proper thing to do. Right.
Okay.
So, Now, Mishima gets caught up in something in the early 60s called the Shimanaka incident. And this actually makes him an enemy of at least temporarily, an enemy of the right. Basically what happens is a friend of Mishima's publishes a story that has a scene in which the crown that it has a dream sequence in the story in which the crown prince and princess Michiko are executed in the story, right? Their heads are cut off. The Great Japan Patriotic Party, of which that assassin Yamaguchi was a member, called for the death of not only the author of this story, but the publisher as well, because Mishima was his friend, and it was assumed that Mishima had helped to get it published. Mishima and his family were the target of death threats because of this, right? So the right, in the early 60s, the right wants to kill him, and he's publicly, the left doesn't like him either. Mishima was apparently so terrified by these death threats, he would be marching around his house, like outside of his house, like on guard all night, and these sorts of things. Mishima's brother says that the reason Mishima swung so hard to the right in the 1960s is because he was scared of the right, and he thought if he joined them, at least they wouldn't kill him.
Whoa.
That's what his brother said. Now, I'm not saying that's true, but that's what his brother said. His brother also said that his thing at the end, the attempted coup, was just Mishima playing war.
Yeah, no.
So, but I thought it's worth noting that that's
interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
Boy, man, it does. It gets gnarly when people start saying, "We're gonna come and kill you. We're coming for your family."
Yeah.
When it gets to that volume, like the fence sitting comes to an end very quickly.
Yeah. Now
it finally always is the friend enemy distinction, really. It always kind of comes down to that.
Yeah.
When it gets that real, when it's
right.
Are we safe on our own home?
Right.
Which finally ultimately is all that politics is about.
Well, I mean, right. Government is just what are your opinions on what the people's welfare should be carried out, right? So it's really welfare at the end, not
welfare and safety. Safety is very high. Safety is welfare vibrating at a very high level.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, I did not. This is very these 60s for Mishima. And of course, like in the background, like, I want to hold your hand. Right. I mean, it's like we're in that period.
Mm-hmm.
And political assassinations, and he's figuring out where he's going to live politically. Fascinating.
Yeah. Now, I want to read one thing about this. Is the brother's claim that he swung to the right for his own safety. Basically, this is from John Nathan biography talking about that. Quote: "This seems far-fetched. This seems far-fetched. Although unquestionably, Mishima did possess what amounted to a masochistic impulse towards, quote, self-improvement. More likely, the lasting effect of those weeks of terror is to be read in his refusal to associate with what he called the established right. Time and time again, particularly after 1966, central figures of the right offered Mishima support, which he refused." Okay. Now, now through the 60s, he maintains this brutal schedule of writing and lifting weights, right? This is the rest of his life is basically that, but we'll get to some other things that are going on. He keeps, there's books keep coming out. I didn't read all of them, and we're not going to talk about all of them because there is a lot of books. But I do want to talk about a book called The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. This is a book published in 1963 and translated into English by the same guy who wrote this biography in 1965. So the basic setup of this book, which I also highly recommend, he's got three main characters. The first is a 13-year-old boy named Noboru. His father has passed away, I think, 5 years before the book starts, and he lives with his mother, Fusaku, who is a successful proprietor of a fashion vintage store in Yokohama, port city. She ends up hooking up with this sailor named Ryuji, who's this kind of intense loner in his mid-30s, and a guy who is essentially no life outside of the sea. He's the sailor who fell from grace with the sea, right? Now, Noboru has been spying on his mother through a peephole in his bedroom that he can peer into his mother's room, and he ends up peeping in on his mother and Fusaku, and the sailor having sex, right? It's very erotically described. He's sort of turned on by this, Noboru is, but it's more like, I don't even know if it's so much erotic to him, but it's like this mystery that he's able to observe, and he's not sure if he can kind of handle. Eventually, Fusaku and Ryuji get closer together until they get married. Great. Noburu's got a father figure, and there's a way in which this is all set up to be a very nice, happy ending kind of story. The problem is Noburu is caught up in a little intellectual gang of 13-year-olds who seem to be practicing, in some ways, an extreme version of Mishima's own thought process. Let me give you an example. These are the words of the chief of this little gang of 13-year-olds.
Like a little Lord of the Flies kind of.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is. Let me give you a couple things they said, or the chief says. Talking about not being able to buy, one of the kids is not, his dad won't buy him an air rifle. And this is what the chief says about it. That's crap. They don't even know the definition of danger. They think danger means something physical, getting scratched and a little blood running and the newspapers making a big fuss. Well, that hasn't got anything to do with it. Real danger is nothing more than just living. Of course, living is merely the chaos of existence, but more than that, it's a crazy mixed up business of dismantling existence instant by instant to the point where the original chaos is restored and taking strength from the uncertainty and the fear that chaos brings to recreate existence instant by instant. You won't find another job as dangerous as that. There isn't any fear in existence itself or any uncertainty, but living creates it. And society is basically meaningless, a Roman mixed bath. And school is just society in miniature. That's why we're always being ordered around. A bunch of blind men tell us what to do, tear our unlimited ability to shreds. But how about the sea? Noburo persisted. How about a ship? Last night, I'm sure I caught the meaning of the internal light order of life you talked about. The chief responded, I suppose the sea is permissible to a certain extent. Okay. Let me give you one other one.
That's an interesting thing about Japanese culture is that they are surrounded by the ocean, and yet, I don't know. I don't know much about their seafaring. I don't know what they were up to on the ocean.
Yeah, I don't know the maritime culture aspect of it. Yeah,
no, I don't know. Yeah, hey, a sailor's a sailor.
Yeah, in some ways. Yeah.
When the sailor comes into port, the sailor wants what he wants.
He wants
a
rum.
Sailor's a sailor bred.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, there you go.
Here's another bit from the chief of this little gang. Quote, there's no such thing as a good father because the role itself is bad. Strict fathers, soft fathers, nice moderate fathers, one's as bad as another. They stand in the way of our progress while they try to burden us with their inferiority complexes and their unrealized aspirations and their resentments and their ideals and the weaknesses they've never told anyone about and their sins and their sweeter than honey dreams and the maxims they've never had the courage to live by. They'd like to unload all that silly crap on us, all of it. Even the most neglectful fathers like mine are no different. Their consciences hurt them because they've never paid any attention to their children, and they want the kids to understand just how bad the pain is, to sympathize. Okay, let me give you one more. Sorry. We're getting there, Kevin.
No, he's channeling the youth energy of the 60s, man. It's happening. That is.
Yeah. Here's another thing the chief says. This is towards the end of the book. Quote, all six of us are geniuses. That's the 6 kids in the little gang. All six of us are geniuses, and the world, as you know, is empty. I know I've said this before, but have you ever thought about it carefully? Because to assume for those reasons that we are permitted to do anything we want is sloppy thinking. As a matter of fact, we are the ones who do the permitting. Teachers, schools, fathers, society, we permit all those garbage heaps. And not because we're powerless either. Permitting is our special privilege. And if we felt any pity at all, we wouldn't be able to permit this ruthlessly. So the chief first sort of initiates Noburo and the rest of the gang into a kind of romantic relationship with death by having Noburo murder a cat, a little kitten. And then they all sort of ritually dissect it, and it goes on for pages. It's a little difficult to read, frankly. Poetic descriptions of the inner organs of a cat, right? Now, as it goes on, the sailor becomes more of a father figure in Noboru's life, but he doesn't live up to the heroic ideal that the gang would have for him. He's supposed to be this sort of like stoic, poetic, heroic figure, sailor coming in from the sea. But as Ryuji, the sailor, he keeps making concessions and compromises to become like a normal person integrated into society, right? He's nice. He smiles he starts smiling at people, right? He's becoming like a normal person. The tribe cannot handle this. And spoiler alert, they kill him. The tribe of 13-year-old boys kill him. That's the end of the story. Right.
Okay.
So anyway, that's the sailor who fell from the grace from the sailor who fell from grace with the sea. Beautiful little novel. Pretty quick.
Nailed it. And Brad, you are doing a fabulous job.
Thank you, sir.
Well into what we're heading into the fifth hour.
Yeah.
One through the, if I can count. So another Art of Darkness core episode coming in hot. One more time. I know Brad has more to do. Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. We have a lot of subscribers. We have a lot of listeners. We have a lot of patrons, but it could be better.
Yes.
Let's grow it. Get it in. Go there. You're not going to want to miss the After Dark. I know Brad's going to have some juicy stuff. And later in the year, the book club, Blood Meridian, Aaron Gwynn. Going to be a good time. We're all going to hang out. We love it. Where are we here? What year are we roughly right now, Brad?
So this book is written. This book is written in Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea is written in 1963. He's got 7 more years. Yeah.
Okay, we're coming up to
1965. So we'll kind of skip slightly ahead. 1965 and on. 1965, he begins putting out his final tetralogy of novels. This is called The Sea of Fertility.
He was so prolific.
Oh my God. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. The Sea of Fertility is made up of 4 novels. The first is Spring Snow, and there's Runaway Horses, The Temple of Dawn, and The Decay of the Angel. All of these have been translated into English. Let me give you we're not going to go deep into these novels, really. There's a lot of different ways to have framed this episode with the work. One of them would have been to spend all of it on the tetralogy, honestly. Yeah, and there's a lot of ways to skin that. There's a lot of ways to skin this cat, Matt. But we won't spend a ton of time on the tetralogy. Skin the cat, because that's what the kids did in the Sailor Club.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay. The tetralogy. The story stretches from 1912 to 1975. The viewpoint of all 4 books is that of Shigekuni Honda, a law student. He's a law student in Spring Snow, and eventually at the end of The Decay of the Angel, he's a wealthy retired judge. Each of the novels depicts what Honda comes to believe are successive reincarnations of his school friend Matsugi, and Honda's attempts to save them from the reincarnations from the early deaths to which they seem to be condemned by karma. This results in both personal and professional embarrassment for Honda and eventually destroys him. The friends' incarnations are, in the first book, a young aristocrat, and the second book, a nationalist and violent extremist, and the third, an indolent Thai princess, and in the fourth, a manipulative and sadistic orphan. And so these are all reincarnation. These are all successive incarnations of his friend. I'll read you the plot of like the real high level plot overview of a couple of them, just so you get a sense of what this whole thing is about. Spring Snow is set in the early years of the Taisho period with the reign of Emperor Taisho, and is about the relationship between Matsugi, this is the one that's reincarnating all the time, who is the son of a rising nouveau riche family, and Ayakura, the daughter of an aristocratic family fallen on hard times. Honda, our protagonist, is a school friend of Matsuga's, the recurring person, and is the main witness to the events. The novel's themes center on the conflicts in Japanese society caused by Westernization in the early 20th century. So that book basically takes place from 1912 to 1914. Runaway Horses, the book that comes out, the second part comes out in 1969. This is about this is set between June 1932 and December 1933. Tells the story of a rightist reactionary trained in the samurai code by his father. He becomes the instigator of a plot to topple the Zaibatsu that he feels have corrupted the Yamato Damashi and betrayed the will of the emperor. Basically, political intrigue and ideological extremism. He is assured of the army's assistance by the young Lieutenant Hori. They have planned to assassinate many key government figures simultaneously in 1932. Honda, who figured prominently in Spring Snow, appears here as a judge. He comes to believe that the rightist reactionary is his friend, right? Reincarnation of his friend. And so it kind of goes on like this. And the idea is we're seeing the history, the 20th century history of Japan through this reincarnating figure, through this guy who is in the legal profession as a law student and finally a judge. And we're sort of witnessing the cultural trends of Japan through this lens, with discourses on Buddhism, on Hinduism, on death, on eternity, right? It's really Mishima's masterpiece.
Ambitious,
and very ambitious.
Four novels.
Four novels, yeah, that come out over the course of about 5 years. Now, the people who love this book, excuse me, the people who love this set of books will basically say that Mishima captured better than anybody else the spiritual realities of Japan in the 20th centuries. Reviewers speak to the subtle beauty of the book, the cosmic scope, the culmination of the various themes Mishima has been working on through his whole career. It really is the capstone on the Mishima pyramid, right? And I do want to spend more time. I read a big chunk of Spring Snow, and I read a big chunk of a couple of the others. I didn't manage to read the whole thing straight through. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of book. And was I'm impressed, as I always am, by the style of Mishima, the acuity. Again, what I'm continuously impressed by is his ability to get you down to that particular grain of experience and somehow say something that seems to apply to every human being who ever lived. He's so good at that. And the poetry of it that even seems to survive translation so well, surprisingly well in a way. So definitely recommend at least poking around on the Wikipedia of this tetralogy and seeing if it jumps out to you of interest. As a counterpoint to this sort of praise, I want to give you a little bit about what an American scholar of this said in 1972. This woman, Marley Ryan, who is a noted American scholar of Japanese literature. She translated Ukigumo, which is, I'm probably not saying Ukigumo, which is considered the first modern Japanese novel, right? So she's a big player in the scene. She's an American. I'll give you what her take is on the tetralogy. It's not positive. Okay. Quote, "In the final analysis, the publicity surrounding Mishima's suicide and his publisher's attempt to capitalize on it have done him a great disservice. The tetralogy is painfully overwritten and crammed full of obvious gimmicks, but it does often hold the reader's interest. We have a long acquaintance with the protagonist, Honda, extending over some 60 years of his life, and we find ourselves engrossed in his agonizingly long decay. At least 2 and possibly 3 of the other characters command our attention for extended periods, and we read eagerly to see how each of their lives is resolved. This is the stuff a good popular novel is made of, and although we are nauseated by the sick sex, and dripping gore, we can accept Mishima's world as yet another manifestation of the, quote, reality that fixates modern authors. What we cannot tolerate is the shaky philosophic skeleton on which the entire plot is built." Henry Scott Stokes' biography, The Life and Death of Mishima, for all its naivete, contains some important insights. He speaks of reading over a manuscript Mishima had prepared at his request for publication in England. Quote, this is from Henry Scott Stokes. Quote, the article itself was not too interesting. He seems to know nothing about politics in Japan, and I am not interested in samurai, etc. After all, samurai disappeared from Japan almost 100 years ago. They went with the feudal system. Mishima seems to share the Western illusion that Japan is still a nation of samurai. No wonder he gets on well with foreigners. In him, they find a Japanese who is a samurai. This is back in Marley Ryan's voice. The point here is that Mishima seems to share many Western illusions about not only Japan, but all of Asia. Time and again, we are struck with the feeling that the tetralogy is the work of a Westerner who happens to have chosen an Asian setting because of its exoticism. While this is particularly noticeable in Spring Snow, which presents an unconvincing movie scenario of Japan in the 1910s, the impression recurs even in the sections dealing with the most contemporary period. We are left with the impression that Mishima did not truly experience his own country. His characters move in a curious vacuum, referring to life but never participating in it. Their foibles, and they are legion, may or may not be shared by people in Japan, but they are identical with the foibles depicted by Western European and American 20th century authors. The lesbians, the fanatics, the bisexuals, the voyeurs, the sadists are all not by now stock characters in Western fiction. We are tired of them. We find nothing new or enlightening about Mishima's use of psychological aberration, and we fail to see how his handling of human degradation contributed anything to our understanding of Asia or the world. The possibility emerges that Mishima wrote this tetralogy in one final desperate attempt to capture a Western audience. Begun in 1965, the year Mishima was first mentioned as a candidate for the Nobel Prize, the author was greatly concerned with its translation, even to the extent of sending off letters urging its American publication on the very day he ended his life. He coveted recognition from foreigners and openly courted their friendship. More than that, he seems to have had a need to conquer the Western world. One is haunted by Fabian Bauer's scurrilous but obviously truthful article in the Village Voice shortly after Mishima's death, in which he describes an overpowering urge Mishima had to fly to America in the middle of the night to find an American man with whom to have sexual intercourse. This is not simply an author's wish to see his fame spread. It is a driving compulsion to conquer, to bring the Western world to heel. Now, I don't read all of that to say I agree with Marley Ryan, but I thought it was such a scathing criticism that it needed to be thrown out there.
Yeah, that's not a bad review. That is an indictment
of an entire human's motivational system. Yeah, yeah. I don't know enough about Marley Ryan. I do think it's odd that an American, who I think is an American scholar, is saying that a Japanese person doesn't understand Japan. It's sort of like, well, how do you know?
Who are you to say?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then also, I think it's important to note too, the way that Mishima died. He died at the head of an ultra-right militia. And then, oh, you mean a bunch of academics are going to have issues with him?
Right. Fair
enough.
You
know what I mean?
Like, they're
gonna
of course.
They're going to look for reasons why he's not as gifted or his masterpieces, So I just thought it was important to kind of try to
get that in there a little bit.
A little bit what's going on. Okay. Now, 1965, Mishima's overlooked for the Nobel. Actually would go to his one-time mentor, Yasunari Kawabata, who we mentioned earlier, in 1968. Mishima decides that he's never going to win the Nobel Prize, partially because of this, but also not. Remember, that sword has always been coming towards his stomach. He kind of enters what seems to be, in retrospect, his sort of final death spiral. I think there are 3 quotes that are used in the Schrader film that help us understand this era. They're using the Schrader film, but they're in Mishima's voice. Quote, "A writer is a voyeur par excellence. I sought to be the seer and the seen." Quote, another quote, "When a man reaches 40, he loses the chance to die beautifully." And another one, "Absolute purity is possible if you turn your life into a line of poetry with a splash of blood." Okay. Now, he, what happened there? Okay. In 1965, this is the last run of his life, these last 5 years. In 1965, he finances and makes a film version of his story Patriotism, that ends in a ritual seppuku scene. Um, he basically made a film version of what he would later do, right? And so, right, he makes a film version of a guy committing ritual seppuku, and then he does it 5 years later. This is not. It shouldn't have surprised anyone that it happened in 1970. At this point, if you're paying attention to what he was doing, right, he's telling you what he's planning. He's doing trial runs of it, and it's shown in the Schrader film of them doing it with a prop knife, right? Sort of, yeah. So in some ways, it as it gets closer and closer, just makes it's almost inevitable in a certain sense, to me, as I'm reading through this stuff.
One of my instructors in playwriting once said that a sign of great drama is that the conclusion feels surprising but inevitable.
Yes. Yeah. And that's exactly what Mishima's last moments are. It's like, yeah, when it's over, you're like, of course that was going to happen. How there's almost no other way. There's no other way to end the scene in any like way that feels resonant or meaningful.
He's another case for me, though. You know what? I'll save it. I'll save it for the After Dark for Patreon because I don't want to derail you. But he could have benefited from an extra 5 to 10% more chill. I'll just say that.
Yeah, yeah. In 1966, he is introduced to a few young ultra nationalists who seem very serious about the cause. I'm going to read this a little bit. This is Mishima's words. It is a date I will not forget. December 19th, 1966, a dark, rainy winter afternoon. As I listened to him, Bandai, one of the young ultra nationalists, describe in his halting way the difficulties experienced by a group of youth who belonged to no political party, but were resolved to cure Japan of her ills and who had sworn unity, something stirred in me. Right. So at 41 years old, he feels like he's got a cause suddenly. In 1967, he enlists in this weird maneuver. He enlists in the Japanese the Japanese self-defense force. The Japanese weren't allowed to have technically an army, but they were allowed to have a small force that was intended to repel invasion, basically. Through a series of favors, he's allowed to participate in boot camp, which he does under his his birth name, so to avoid like publicity. But he participates in boot camp, and he sort of loves it. Let's see. He began with a week at officers training school. From there, he went to the infantry boot camp at the foot of Mount Fuji for a month. He spent 2 final weeks running up and down mountains with the Ranger Division and hurling himself off a 30-foot jump tower with fledgling paratroopers. Mishima was 42, his fellow volunteers in their high teens, yet he managed to keep pace day after day after driving himself as only he could. Secretly, he suffered stomach cramps and diarrhea. The auto-intoxication thing he suffered from a child never 100% went away. But the physical punishment very likely added to his pleasure, if for no other reason than that it helped him feel like one of the men. Okay. He also at this time starts to take the notion of Bushido very seriously, and paraphrases in his New Year's Day article. He used to write an article every New Year's Day in one of the big Japanese newspapers. He took this bit of writing from a samurai turned monk let's see if I can find it here. Do I have it? Oh, sorry, a couple pages off. Quote, know that the essence of Bushido is to die. This means that the samurai, when faced with a choice between life and death, chooses death. It is as simple as that. To say that death, which achieves nothing, is death in vain, dog's death as it is called, is the kind of calculating Bushido practiced in the Kyoto area. So long as you have chosen death, it does not matter whether you have died in vain. Death cannot be to your discredit. That's his New Year's Day message to the nation. Now, we could get into a lot of ins and outs of what happened with the Shield Society, but there's a whole book to be written or read about that. I think if we want to be generous to Mishima, I think we can say that so what happened with the Shield Society is he wanted to join sort of the army self-defense force. That didn't really work. he tried to join up with some other people to start a kind of a national guard, and that didn't quite work either. So what he eventually resolves to do is he's going to basically start a militia, the Shield Society. And the idea is that they will rush in to protect Japan. And at first it's under a weird agreement with the Japanese government. The Shield Society is allowed to train at the Mount Fuji base. And they're sort of given, I think he had some sympathetic people within the government. And I think also Mishima's celebrity itself kind of allowed him to do this, right? I think he had...
They do a good job of showing that in the biopic.
Yeah.
Where it's like he just sort of walks through the door.
Yeah.
You're not going to stop him.
He's Mishima. Yeah.
He's Mishima.
Yeah. He's a big deal. I think we can say that Mishima had some genuine concerns about Japan. He didn't like the fact that it had given up. He thought its martial spirit was an essential part to its culture. And again, the ending of World War II, they're basically not allowed to have a military. Well, if you think the military is a essential aspect of your culture, you can't just give it up, right? That's like giving up your whole history in a way. And I think Mishima felt that way. I think he had a genuine concern that the leftist fervor was going to take the country in a progressive direction that he did not like. I think he believed that to maintain the spirit of Japan, there had to be men had to be willing to die for it, and not some syncretic East-West version of Japan, but actual, in his eyes, actual Japan. Never mind that he himself dressed in aloha shirts and Levi's. Put that to the side. He starts to build up the Shield Society under these, various auspices. He recruits young men from college campuses with the goal of getting 100 young men in the group. They, like I said, they start training.
That feels inevitable.
Yeah, you're right. He leads the trainings at Mount Fuji, right? He's the one who's going to train them into being the Shield Society. And interestingly enough, of the men he recruited, he tried to avoid any men who had like literary pretensions. Most of the men in the Shield Society had never really read any of Mishima's work, and he preferred it that way. He didn't think literary men would make good soldiers, basically. So trying to think of the best way to do this. Now, he gets made fun of in the press for doing this. They joke about Mishima's toy soldiers, right? And he is financing most of this himself, right? Because he's a wealthy man. So he's buying the uniforms and he's paying for the food and, all of this kind of stuff.
I don't know, man. There might have been a point in college where if some famous author had come along and offered me food and shelter and fun and games and
right. I mean, like, that sounds fun. Let's go do that for a while.
Probably wouldn't have, but yeah. Mishima is sort of becoming the ultimate karate man. He's like got a dojo roadshow going on. He's intense.
Yeah. Now he writes a couple of sort of in response to being mocked in the media, but also just generally, he writes a couple of different pieces, sort of laying out what the point of this is. One is called The Defense of Culture, where he basically makes the argument that the Japanese are Japanese by the virtue of Japanese culture, which feels like a tautology. But he also makes the point that the emperor is the, quote, sole source and guarantor of Japanese culture. And so defending the emperor was tantamount to defending the culture. Basically saying, I think this is a fair paraphrasing of, when we lost the emperor, we lost Japan. I don't know. I don't know enough. I can't argue on one way or the other. That's what Mishima is basically saying.
Fair enough. If the sovereignty lives in the emperor was a god. That is where the nation resided.
Right.
Yeah. You could make that argument. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
They're going to reconstitute and become a democracy, and it's the same thing? No, it really isn't.
It isn't this. It isn't the same thing.
Now, that is to say, it's still, it's Japan, but you could see, you could see his side.
Right.
Fair
enough. Yeah. Now here's a thing that this is a quote from him.
It's like when McDonald's took the play guys off the playground. Like, there's no longer have the little play area.
Right. Now it's just a playground.
The hamburger. It's not the same.
It's not.
It's not the same.
Yeah. Are you getting hungry there, Kev?
I am actually starting to get a little bit hungry. That might be that. I probably should not have compared the Japanese empire to old-timey McDonald's. Although I say that with love.
Sure.
Do you remember the McDonald's play area? You could go and sit on a little hamburger and have statues of Grimace and stuff. God, I'm hungry.
I remember when that came to our town, man.
I am thinking of hamburgers right now. Okay, go on, Brad. Go on.
Okay, here's a quote from Mishima. Quote, since the ultimate source of the honor of the chrysanthemum and the sword is the emperor, military honor must also proceed from the emperor. Supreme command must be restored to him. Needless to say, he must accept a military guard of honor. Since 1967, Mishima had been complaining of Hirohito's post-war policy of refusing an honor guard on formal occasions. Anyway, that bothered Mishima quite a bit. It is urgent that the emperor and the army be linked with bonds of honor. Naturally, the restoration of supreme command and other rights of sovereignty must result in the revival not of a political but a cultural emperor. Now, another thing that Mishima writes around this time. Oh, let me read this other thing too, which I think was fascinating. And there's a way that you got to kind of try to fit this into his. Okay. He also was going on these things where he was like debating leftist students on campuses for a while. And here's a little excerpt from one of those. Student to Mishima. To say as you do that culture developed together with the emperor implies that culture is the special possession of one very limited group. In Japanese history, that period when the emperor was in control was a time when a great many people lived almost like slaves. In my opinion, the culture that belonged merely to the privileged class is just nonsense. If culture like that is tradition, then that tradition should be destroyed. Mishima responded. Culture cannot be understood in Marxist terms of history as class struggle. All philosophies fail when it comes to theories of literature and art. Those of you who have read Kant know this, but when the critique of pure reason tries to handle the question of beauty, it tumbles as if it had slipped on a banana peel. The same happens to Hegel when he tries to organize culture into a system. If ever there was a Marxist who understood culture, it was Trotsky. Trotsky maintained that government had to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, but that culture could be bourgeois. As a result, it was only during the brief time that Trotsky was in power that the Soviet produced anything deserving the name of culture. That's when you get Mayakovsky's poetry. Unlike Hitler, Trotsky didn't label all previous European culture decadent and urban, and he eagerly imported new art from Europe. Then Trotsky was purged by people like you. Now, another time in another interview, when he's getting pressed about what his issue is with the left, Mishima just says, look, I needed an enemy. I needed an enemy to activate myself, and I just picked you guys. So where is he in all this stuff? How much of... I'll leave this to the audience to decide the level of sincerity he had on the political front versus how much was Mishima enacting some kind of piece of performance art that he had always been pointed at, right? He also issued a counter-revolutionary manifesto. We love manifestos on the pod.
We got a manifesto. Ring. We got a manifesto. Here we go. Let's go. We love manifestos on the pod.
Now, it's quite long, so I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read...
Usually it doesn't take this long to get to the manifesto.
I know.
Usually the manifestos are things of youth.
Yeah, they're early, and this is late, right? Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to read just two or three of the points. 1. We do not oppose all revolutions, be they violent or nonviolent. We oppose all designs and all action that seek to link communism with administrative power. It goes without saying that this includes all plans of or including the formation of a democratic coalition pro-communist government. We will not be deceived by the mask of internationalism or of nationalism, and we will not be misled by the methodological deceptions of direct democratic, popular front, or other forms. We oppose all forms of linking communism with administrative power. Okay. Here's another one. Where's the fifth one? Is there a fifth one? Yeah. Okay, hold on. Let me give you another one. Number 3, I think. We have observed the post-war revolutionary thought has moved entirely in accordance with the mass principle of the weak. However violent its expression may be, it is an ideology of the weak that is inseparable from the principles of the mass and the organization. This is a mass movement that spreads uncertainty, doubt, hatred, malice, and jealousy, uses these as the basis of their threats, and with these, the most base passions of the weak as its common element, aims at particular goals. Under the pretext of empty and conceptually naive ideas, they join together on the basis of the basest passions of the weak, gained the majority democratically, rule all subgroups and subsocieties, and have thereby oppressed the minority and seeped into all areas of society. This is their method. Okay, I'm going to give you one more. This is 5. Verbal struggle, economic struggle, and political struggle are their well-worn devices, and to propose dialogue is to already be immersed in their strategy. Their battle must take place only once, and it must be one of life and death. After the battle of life and death, it is history, the values of the spirit and morality that shall pass judgment. Our counter-revolution is an act of intercepting the enemy at water's edge, and this water's edge is that of Japanese territory. It is not that of Japanese territory, but the breakwater in the soul of each and every Japanese. Though our enemies be legion, we must strike a blow at the vile hordes of revolution. In the teeth of the slander and abuse, the ridicule and the provocations of the masses, in order to awaken the worm-eaten spirit of Japan, with these our lives, we must strike a blow at them. We are those who shall embody the aesthetic tradition of Japan. So when you talk about aesthetic, we say, oh, that's a very aesthetic photo. Think about what the hell was Mishima talking about when he said the aesthetic tradition of Japan? What was he doing, right? What did that mean? What does that mean? That concept mean to him? Now, we're almost there. Throughout most of the existence of the Shield Society, Mishima was talking a lot about death, but he wasn't talking about seppuku. He was talking about kirigini, which is another form of violent death in the warrior code. And it means basically to die with a sword in your hand, to die in battle, right? And if you can't die in battle, then you die in seppuku, in shame. Or really ritually sublimate your shame into honor. The idea that of kirigini that they had was that basically what they expected to happen is there was an upcoming renewal of the treaty between Japan and the United States. And the left really didn't want it to happen because basically that treaty sided Japan with the U.S. effectively in the Cold War. I'm boiling this down a lot, right? And the left, the communists in particular, most wanted to be more associated with the Soviet Union, is my understanding of it. And if I'm getting this wrong, I apologize. So the left was making waves as though they were going to try to interrupt the signing of this treaty. And what Mishima thought was going to happen is that as the treaty approached, the left were going to riot. They would overwhelm the police. And because Japan didn't have a proper military, they wouldn't have any force to be able to put down the left, and the left would take over the country. That's what Mishima thought was going to happen. That was sort of his violent fantasy. And he thought, well, we'll be the Shield Society and we'll come in and we'll be the final barricade against the left taking over Japan completely. That's what he thought. Okay. Now, the trick, though, was that the treaty came up. There was a small demonstration. The Tokyo police handled it very easily. The treaty was signed, and things kind of just continued on as normal. And so the violent upheaval that Mishima thought that his Shield Society would sacrifice itself to prevent basically just didn't happen. He imagined that there was this need for this thing, and it wasn't even there. And so now, again, He thought he was romantically going to die in World War II, right? And now he thought he was going to romantically die in defending Japanese culture once again, and it didn't happen. So
gosh darn it, if they're not going to give me a glorious aesthetic death, I'll give me a glorious aesthetic death.
Yes, exactly. So in 1970, he and 4 other members of the Shield Society, nobody else in the Shield Society, which was at least 90 people and maybe as many as 100 people, nobody else apparently knew about this plan but his 4 closest guys. These were Masakatsu Morita, Masahiro Ogawa, Masayoshi Koga, and Hiroyasu Koga. First, though, okay, let me just give you the day this happened. Mishima writes the last paragraph of The Decay of the Angel on November 25th, 1970. And let me just read you that really quickly because it's quite nice. The last piece of what he thought of as his masterpiece. Quote, and I want you to think about the fact that he would later that day, he would do this thing, right? Quote, there was no other sound. The garden was empty. He had come, thought Honda, to a place that had no memories, nothing. The noontide sun of summer flowed over the still garden. He writes those words. And then he and his closest group in the Shield Society, using contacts within the military, they got into Camp Ichigaya, which is a military base in central Tokyo and the headquarters for the Eastern Command of the Japan Self-Defense Forces. They got a meeting with a commandant, and after some pleasantries, in which are pretty well shown in the Paul Schrader film, where he says, "Is that a real sword?" The commandant says, "Is that a real sword?" And they say, "Yes." And the commandant says, "Are you allowed to carry that?" They tie the commandant down to his chair. They barricade the door, and it takes approximately 10 minutes, apparently, before Mishima is able to convince the military that this is real, that it's not a joke. Their first thought is that it's a joke, like it's a prank of some
sort
kind.
Of strange stunt.
And Mishima's a weird guy. He's a writer. He's a writer. He's known for his eccentricity.
He's a man of the theater.
Right. And he's conducting one last big piece of theater, right? He issues a few demands. The most noteworthy of them is that he wants all of the soldiers at the base to be brought out in front of the balcony, and he steps out onto the balcony and basically tried to rouse a coup that would restore the emperor, right? One of the things he's shouting is, "Where has the spirit of the samurai gone?" And this is what's interesting to me about that Marley Ryan criticism of the tetralogy. She's saying, it's not a nation of samurai anymore. Why is he being so ridiculous? But he's literally saying, like, we lost something when that left. Like, I don't know. There's a certain disconnect to say, like, it'd be like in America, like trying to think of like a version of this in America. Like if in America you were to say, where did the pioneering spirit that America used to have, where did that rugged individualism we used to have go? And somebody just laughing at you going like, we don't need that anymore.
Sure. Yeah, we don't need cowboys. Who needs them?
That's silly. Don't
rugged independence.
Right.
Yeah. Emerson, Thoreau.
We're beyond all
John
that.
Wayne.
Right.
You know what I tell you? Statues of the founding. You know what?
Yeah.
Fuck them. We don't need any of that.
And if you think that stuff's important, then you must not know what America
you must be a reactionary and madman.
Right.
And and by the way, this country will still be the same country with or without cowboys, of course.
Right.
Just as long as Kevin can eat a Happy Meal sitting on a smiley plastic hamburger.
Yeah.
If we can just get that.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Yeah. This is the soul of the soul of a nation, the soul of a people.
Right.
I know that it's not it's not it's almost déclassé to talk about that now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It sort of puts you on the right, but it's like a thing. It's a real thing. I don't think we're imagining it. Yeah.
Right. This is my point. It's not to say that he's necessarily right or anything or correct or anything. I don't even know enough about Japanese culture to know, really, to be honest. I'm sort of just trying to, but like, certainly it seems like he's got a point, a point that you can argue about. Right.
It's very, very difficult to argue that someone of Mishima's quality as an artist and as a writer, as a thinker, because writing is indistinguishable from thinking, was a madman. Right. At the end here. No.
Right.
So
it's just if his motivations seem inscrutable, it's because that doesn't necessarily mean they're illogical or insane, right? To me, I don't have the understanding of I don't have any urge towards a poetic death. But if that had been instilled in me when I was a boy,
sure.
You know what I mean? Yeah. This might make a lot different.
Let me know if you ever start to feel the urge for having a poetic death, so I can avoid being in the same car with you, being on the same plane with you. I'll just change my travel plans. And just let me know. Let me know.
Yeah. I will. I'll let you know. You'll be the first.
I want to go on record and say, I support you, but I do not support you.
I understood. Same here. Now there is a couple. We're obviously very close to the end. There's a couple little points I do want to make. So apparently the speech was barely heard. So people refer to this as like a coup attempt. He tried to take over the government. People barely heard the speech. The soldiers mocked and jeered him. There were helicopters flying all over. So, he's trying to shout over helicopters and people yelling at him. He re-enters the commandant's office. He says, I don't even know if they heard me. And then he proceeds to, now he had talked, all four of them had earlier on in the plan had assumed that they would all commit seppuku. And he had talked all of them out of it. He basically talked all of them into not committing suicide. So the notion that this is somehow like a death cult, that he's like some kind of sociopathic, leader of a death cult, that claim would be overblown, I think. Now, one of the other guys did commit suicide, but that was like against Mishima's urgings. But Mishima, kneels down in the commandant's office, draws the short sword, ritually disembowels himself. His second makes 3 attempts to decapitate him, ultimately cannot seem to manage to do it, has to hand the sword over.
He can't bring the sword down? Like he misses, or he doesn't, it's not a clean strike?
My understanding is it's not a clear strike.
Ugh.
So, that's could be pretty dark for, I mean, the whole thing is pretty dark, but and then one of the other Shield Society members,
I gotta say, action. That is the ultimate. You had one job,
right?
You should have been
practicing.
Job. Yeah, there should be 100 watermelons in your backyard.
Right,
you need to be having a
in half
bodybuilding watermelon party.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, imagine talk about shame. Imagine the shame of that. Messing that up.
Yeah, that's heavy. Yeah.
That's the life of Yukio Mishima.
A hotly anticipated episode. I think you delivered, Brad. I feel like I understand him a little more. And at the same time, I feel like I don't.
That's where I come away from it too. There's an uncharitable part of me that wants to say that this is all him just playing out some kind of pathology, but that's one lens. There's not that he had no pathologies, but there's so many ways to look at this final moment. I feel like, is it a piece of theater? Yes. Is it a political action? Yes. Is it, a man enacting his own fate? Yes. Like it's kind of all of these things.
How old was he?
He's 45 years old.
45, and he left behind 2 children and a wife.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle so often with artists who seem to have it all.
Right.
Like this guy he was famous. He was wealthy.
Yeah.
He was respected.
He was respected. Yeah.
And this is the way he opted to go out. It's an absolute cipher to me.
Yeah.
If anybody has any ideas or insight, we love hearing from our listeners. You've made it this far in this episode. Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you for doing that. I know it's a lot of work to prepare these episodes, and you still got more for After Dark.
Yeah, we're talking about his play, his most provocative play
about the Austrian, the painter. So what do we think Mishima would be doing now if he was alive in his prime right now?
Yeah.
What does his world look like?
Yeah, it's tricky because here's kind of the thing I think about him. I think he was constantly looking for a way for this to be the end. And it's like a novelist constantly knowing. I've written some novels. I often know what the sort of last image or the last move is. And a lot of it's about trying to find your way to it, right? It's like, I know it's going to end like this, but I don't know how I know point A and B, but I don't know a bunch of different steps to get to Z. And I kind of feel like he was always looking for the route to this end and finally found it. So I feel like if he hadn't found it there, he would have just kept looking for it. And he would have found some way to get to this endpoint. He would have written some more books and he would have come up with some new justifications, but he would have eventually found his way through the labyrinth to this end. That's my take on it. I
agree. And I feel like we're almost committing an aesthetic crime or a sin by asking the question, because he took such a he decided to opt out. He decided to get out of the world. So let's leave Yukio Mishima in 1970 in Japan and take a quick break. Get ready to come back for patreon.com/artofdarkpod. We are going to talk about the play Brad has been hinting at. We also like in the dark or in the After Darks, we like to cut loose a little bit. We kind of just riff and hang out. It's a really good time. How do you feel, Brad? Because you got the most, you're pretty much done. You're in the home stretch now. You feel
good, man. That went by surprisingly fast, as it always does on this side of it. It's like you're just trying to get it to the end. I feel good, but I'm glad to not. I'm going to revisit some of the Mishima writing over time, but I'm glad to put them aside for a minute.
It's a very heavy place to live. I'm living with Beckett right now, and it's like, okay, I get it. It's bleak. Okay, I got it. It's bleak. I got enough Irish in me that I'll be able to get through Beckett and do fine. Last question, Brad. If there was one Mishima book that you would say to people, read this one, which would it be?
I think Temple of the Golden Pavilion is probably the best of what I read. Was the thing that was the most striking to me. I would definitely recommend that. And it's also the most I think the most sophisticated articulation of what his concept of beauty means. And I found that quite striking. So that one's going to live with me for a while.
Another Art of Darkness core episode from the great Brad Kelly. Brad, thank you so much. We will be back
Kevin.
shortly.
Thanks for doing this with me, man.
Yeah, it's a hoot, man. We have a lot of fun. We'll be back on the After Dark, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Thank you so much for listening. I am going to go sit on a hamburger. Hide the swords, hide the knives,
hide the swords.
Jeez, sure. If you have a great career and it ends this way, what happens if you have like a middling to mediocre career?
Yes, Kevin, it's even sadder.